All right, so we had ourselves the Battle Royale, the final grudge match. Stephanie S.J. Thomason versus Dr. Josh. Dun, dun, dun. You talking to me? You talking to me? Yeah, I'm talking to you, cuz. You want to get knocked the F out? You want to get knocked the F out? You just keep talking. Pop, pop, pop to the dome. That's my Stephanie imitation. No, you don't like it? Nobody likes my Stephanie imitation? Oh, well, too bad. Too bad. They're the cat videos. Go watch the cat videos. You want to get knocked the F out, Dr. Josh? I'll kill you. I'll kill you. Don't roll up on me, dog. Pop, pop, pop to the dome. Yeah, she went stone cold gangster on his ass. So, who won? Who won? Who lived to stream again another day? It was Blood-Curdling. So I told you, for all of you people who doubted Dr. Josh, that is exactly how I would have expected Dr. Josh to act. No, it wasn't a blood match. It wasn't death curling. It wasn't even particularly aggressive. I don't even think they raised a voice. It's exactly how Dr. Josh acts. That's why I've been saying, when I've been defending his character in the past. That's how he acted when I had him on my channel like 2 years ago. If you are cool with Dr. Josh, he's eminently reasonable. He'll be civilized, answer questions, and whatever. I've never seen him act any differently than that. If he does, he's perceiving some sort of injustice somewhere. Maybe he's wrong, maybe he's right. And for you Stephanie haters out there too, okay? That's exactly how Stephanie always acts with me. I've known Stephanie for 5 years. She's never done me 1 minute of wrong. So all of you Stephanie haters out there, take a chill. Tone it down a notch. Till the Hun in human form. Never done me 1 minute of wrong. If she ever does, I'll be the first to report it. But she hasn't so far. So that's exactly how I expected both of them to act. Civilized, comport themselves, and have a normal conversation. For the most part, it was a really interesting discussion. It was a pleasant conversation. There was no blood was shed. There was no loss of life. There was no names were even called. Nobody called each other a name even. Nothing to see here. No melodrama at all. That's how I would have expected it to go down. Now, on the substance, there's some really interesting questions here. First of all, yeah, they're coming to get me. They're definitely coming to get me. First of all, on the substance, as I've said in the past, at some point you guys will understand why I say this over and over and over again. Some of this is politics, 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 some of this is politics. Now, some of the ways that people have been, some of what has been going on in this space for the well-nigh past 10 years on the Old Testament is politics. It's politics. The atheist community and the agnostic community, the atheist community and the anti-theists have been running a propaganda war against the Old Testament. And might I say, very successfully. They've been doing a really good job of it. So I'm going somewhere with this. I'm going somewhere with this. Reality check number one. Almost no atheists have read the Old Testament. No matter what they say, almost none of them have. A couple of them have. All the rest of them haven't. They got their where these evil scriptures are in the Old Testament from, Iron Maiden, whatever, Iron Chariots, Iron Maiden, whatever those guys are called. The Iron Chariots website or, I Hate the Bible website. That's where they got their list of terrible scriptures in the Old Testament. Very few of them have read it. Reality check number two. Very few Christians have read the Old Testament either. Hello? Yeah. So all of this hand-wringing and melodrama over how, I can't handle the cognitive dissonance of the Old Testament. I can't even read it without thinking God is a moral monster. It's really exaggerated. It's a propaganda war. Had its origin in our friend Richard Dawkins. The God of the Old Testament is possibly one of the most unpleasant characters in all of literature. He's mean, petty, vindictive, racist. How he gets racist, I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure that's an exact quote. Maybe it's close enough. Said something along those lines. That's where it started. And then the ongoing thing that we see in this space has basically been a propaganda war against the Old Testament that, frankly, Christians, you have aided and abetted. Why? Because you picked up the sword to defend the honor of the Old Testament in ways that are completely oblivious to the propaganda war being fostered upon you. If you go debate the Old Testament and try and rationalize or justify why this particular scripture, first of all, the framing is being borrowed from the fundamentalist, the literalist. Let's take it out of the personal. Let's say Aaron Ra goes to debate how terrible the Old Testament is. Okay, reality check number 3. Aaron Ra is not a Bible literalist. He does not now, nor ever has he considered the Bible inerrant, right? Correct? Okay, so what on earth does he care? There are a couple scriptures here and there that are negative. What on earth does he care? He doesn't. He's borrowing the framing from the fundamentalist. He's borrowing the framing for his entire argument from a Bible literalist, someone who says the Bible is inerrant. If Aaron Ra doesn't think the Bible is inerrant, and he doesn't, then what on earth does he care if God punishes does negative things towards the Amalekites? Reality check number 4. I go to a church today in present-day United States of America, Southern California. If I went to my church today and said out loud to the church, to the congregation, and what do you guys think of God's treatment of the Amalekites? How do you feel about that? How do you wrestle with that? How do you deal with that? You know what most of them would say, 90% of them? Who are the Amalekites, Craig? What are you talking about? I promise you. I swear to God, that's exactly what they say. So, in a sense, that is the good news. Why is that good news? Because the ongoing propaganda war against the Old Testament has not penetrated the consciousness of even the Christian community. They have been dominating this space, the atheists and the secular people and the agnostics. That's why we have these debates all the time, because they have been running a propaganda campaign against the Old Testament. A propaganda campaign against the Old Testament. That's what they have been doing, and it has been very successful, and Christians have aided and abetted them. If you are going to debate why there's this negative scripture in the Old Testament and that negative scripture in the Old Testament, keep in mind that you are going to be losing through the entire course of the debate. Why? Some of this is politics, some of this is politics, some of this is politics, some of this is politics. And as they say in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. The atheists are on one side of the debate, they're going to say the atheist won. The Christians are on the other side of the debate, they're going to say the Christian won. There's the middle ground people. And if you're the Christian just explaining the whole time, looks to them like you're tap dancing the whole time, rationalizing the whole time, justifying the whole time. Very few of these explanations come across as good to the untrained. They come across as good to the Christian who wants to believe that they're good. But very few of them work for the person just watching the debate cold that don't really have don't really know anything about the Old Testament at all. And that's almost everybody, by the way. I'm not kidding when I say most atheists have not read the Old Testament. Most Christians haven't either. Most Christians in this space have. When you get in the actual church, almost nobody has. Almost nobody has. You know, they've tried to, sure, they tried to, and then they bleeped over, like, what, Leviticus, they probably skipped through a whole bunch of it. Probably skipped through all the laws in the Exodus. You know, there's a lot of stuff that they just would have bleeped over, even if they tried to sit down and read the Bible cover to cover. Not that many of them, not as many of them are successful as they report that they were. Just put it that way. So, in the real world, in the real America, in the real church culture, these are still relatively esoteric conversations. That's the point. The fact that they are becoming less esoteric is because the atheists have been winning a propaganda war against the Old Testament for over a decade. They've been demanding that we answer this question. Demand why you answer why God did X when they don't actually care. Why they don't think the Bible's inerrant. So the whole predicate for the debate is kind of jerking your chain right from the start, asking you to enter in a debate that you are pretty much going to lose as a Christian. Why most Christians don't get this? Because they aren't playing to win. They aren't. Most Christians aren't. They have other agendas, and it isn't like let's win the war of ideas and let's actually conquer the territory in the war of ideas. Let's get out there and start claiming this ground in real way, in meaningful ways. That's reality, guys. That's honestly what's going down. Now, what has this got to do with Dr. Josh? Okay, so all of your practicing atheists and secular people, see, there is there's no mistaking that there is a certain voice in the Old Testament that is the voice of fire and destruction and vengeance. Okay, that is one aspect of Yahweh's character in the Old Testament. But what gets neglected in all these conversations is that there's distinctly other voices. It's not the only aspect of God in the Old Testament. It's not. There is a voice in the Old Testament that is distinctly Christ-like, where God is loving, kind, compassionate, a God of mercy, a God of tenderness, a God of compassion. It shows up a lot. It's not hard to find. It's not just in the Psalms and Isaiah. If you go read the Psalms and Isaiah right now, you'll see that voice on almost every page. Even outside of Psalms and Isaiah, though. It's in Deuteronomy. You know, the Song of the Sea. The most common voice of the Old Testament, of the God of the Old Testament, is actually lamenting having to visit sorrow upon his people. That's the most common. It's not enjoying the destruction of, burning the Amalekites and smashing their heads. There's a couple of scriptures like that. A handful. The most common voice in the Old Testament is, I wish I didn't have to punish you guys, but you guys are just terrible douchebags. I wish you were flying right, but you're not. So here, let me, have a sandstorm, destroy all the tents. That's the most common voice. That's the voice of almost all of the prophets. That's the voice in Jeremiah. That's the voice in Isaiah. Isaiah starts off, sinful nation. Nobody can do good. The day of fast, there's thousands of examples. The day of fasting, you strike each other with wicked fists. Is this the fast that I've shown? Thousands of examples. That's by far the most common voice in the Old Testament. There is also the Christ-like voice. Love your neighbor as yourself. God of mercy, God of love. Shows up, interestingly enough, even in Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself, pretty sure it's Leviticus 19. Don't know that for a fact, but as far as I remember, it's in Leviticus somewhere. So there's a Christ-like voice, a spiritual voice in the Old Testament that even your atheist, your agnostic, your I hate the Bible person would recognize as, okay, that's at least positive. The reason why they don't know that is because we have been losing a propaganda war for 10 years. Losing. Going up and debating, dying on a hillside. Let me go debate, If you're going to debate why God said X in the Old Testament, it's your prerogative. But you should keep in mind that debate doesn't play well. The debate, you think you're winning, you aren't. The only people who think you're winning are the Christians. The people in the middle who you're trying to actually influence, who actually don't really know the Bible, you should structure your argument in that debate so they know that those aren't the only scriptures in the Bible. That's not the only voice in the Bible, including the Old Testament. That's all I'm saying. Keep that in mind, that these are propaganda wars, and they have been winning this for a long time. They've been winning it so much that, to most of the people who enter into Twitter and YouTube, the first thing they hear about is how terrible the God of the Old Testament is. Most of these people don't even know that there are scriptures, loving, kind scriptures in the Old Testament. Most of them don't know at all. And it's a disingenuous argument over the structure of the whole thing. The go-to argument is the Old Testament endorses slavery. How that would be meaningful and relevant to Christianity today is if we in the Christian community, if we were slaveholders and we were using the Old Testament to justify it. We aren't. You were 250 years ago. Yeah, exactly. 250 years ago. It's not today. So it's not relevant at all. And even 250 years ago is sketchy. People were using the scripture to justify actions, yes, but there was an economic reason they were doing it. Honest to God, that's the real history of the world, guys. England was just as religious as the South of the United States. They were just as Christian in England as they were in the South of the United States. The reason why slavery ended earlier in England is really simple. There was no economy involved. In the United States of America, the reason why slavery took hold is because of the cotton gin. And slaves were extraordinarily lucrative. That's what kept it in place. The entire economy of the South was based on the slave trade. It was based on, selling cotton all over the world. And the economic bloc of Southern slaveholders at the time of the Civil War were the richest economic bloc in the entire world. They had more money collectively than the industrialists in the North. So the Northern economy was totally based on manufacturing, industrial, and the Southern economy was agrarian, based on slave production. It was the economy that kept the slavery here. It ended way earlier in England. Why? Because slaves were used in England as servants. There was no economic interest involved. You could hire servants, pay them just as much. There was no money to be made out of slavery. That's why it ended earlier in England. So yeah, there were scriptural justifications that kept it in place, but for the most part they were false. The people who were quoting those scriptures were full of garbage. They may have been practicing Christians, but they weren't, as far as I'm concerned, actually paying attention to how the Bible tells you to treat actual living human beings. It's pretty crystal clear in my eyes. How the Bible, everyone is made in the image of God. That's how slavery started appearing wrong to people. If everybody is made in the image of God, then these people who are enslaved are also made in the image of God. And in the Old Testament, to further complicate matters. Okay, why I started this with digital Hammurabi? Now I do not know. And this is a question for the scholars. The digital Hammurabi is a legal text, very similar to the Old Testament. What I'd be very curious is that the weird, crazy, who on earth put this into the legal code parts are very similar. There's a lot of weird stuff in both of them. Why? Because this was a violent, crazy world back then. To some degree, it still is today. Okay, you ever watch Game of Thrones? Game of Thrones is kind of realistic, guys. It kind of is. It's kind of how the world was back in the time of the writing of the Old Testament. Extraordinarily violent. People were, things that people did automatically would strike us now as shocking, cruel, barbaric, horrific. That was true of the Israelites. That was true of people outside of the Israelites. The one difference seems to be, now whether you think this is because of the inspiration of the living God or not, the one difference seems to be that there are traces of true morality, true righteousness in the Old Testament that I'm pretty sure do not appear in the Hammurabi Code. I don't know that for a fact. Traces of true morality. Those traces appear in other religions too. For example, the universalist ethos that even your today's practicing humanist or secular person recognizes, like this brotherhood of man, that type of thing. As far as I know, that first appeared in the Old Testament. The idea that these people outside of our tribe are part of a collective us. That these people outside of our tribe are also us. They're also human beings and they're to be treated with dignity and respect. That is not an idea that was normal to people back then. Back then you were tribalistic to the core. Outside of your tribe they were not humans. They were your enemies. They were to be defeated and destroyed. There's some of that in the Old Testament. But what's more interesting is that there is some of outside of our tribe, those people over there, the immigrant, the foreigner, those are also us. And they're to be treated as such. That's the beginning of the universalist ethos. And it has its predicate in the idea that every man is created in the image of God. Fast forward to the United States of America. We believe these truths to be self-evident. That all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's a clear line from the Old Testament to today. The rights that are inalienable, the idea that each person is a unique human being, that had its origin. That's origin of that entire idea in history can be sourced to the Old Testament, and as far as I know, nowhere else. Now that's an important piece of propaganda in winning the propaganda wars. Why? Most atheists are humanists. Most atheists are like Sam Harris. They believe in the inherent rights of man. Those are new debates that are coming down the pike. Those are the type of debates that Glenn Scrivener has been having. Those are the type of debates. Those are different types of Old Testament debates that favor the Christian, that are propaganda pieces in favor of we in the Christian community. That's what I'm trying to point out. And I'm not sure if I said that all that well. Let me see how much time I have left. What's this got to do with Dr. Josh? I'd be really curious. Maybe I'll even do some research on it myself. But I sincerely doubt that there's anything going on in the Hammurabi Code other than a legal code. Even if you do not believe that the Old Testament is a book from God, you have to recognize, just as a secular person, just as an intelligent human being who actually cares about what's true, that it represented a profound leap forward in the moral development of humankind. If you do not recognize that, you are being dishonest to the core. And Christians have helped you because they've been trying to, make sure you know that every single sentence is absolutely holy and inspired. I don't think that's I don't think that's the appropriate goal. Why? Some of this is politics. Some of this is politics, some of this is politics, some of this is politics. That is a bad political argument. You engage in that debate, you're going to be losing the entire debate. It looks like you're tap dancing to justify things that, to the untrained observer, seem clearly wrong. Now, it's possible that the Old Testament is inerrant. Possible. But if you're going to engage in a debate about the Old Testament under those grounds, you should be aware that you are going to be losing a political propaganda debate. So you should have other things that you bring up. By the way, the Old Testament also does this. Talks about the inherent rights of man. That idea is sourced to the Old Testament, and as far as I know, nowhere else in the history of the world. The beginning of true spiritual awakening comes in the Old Testament. Whether you believe that's the living God, Jesus Christ, inspiring the authorship or not, there is no denying, even on secular rationalist terms, that there is a profound leap forward in the moral awakening of humankind in the books of that Bible. There's no denying that. Prior to the Bible being written, there was no such thing as an idea that other human beings were actually human beings too. And we're all part of the human family. There's no such thing as that idea anywhere else. Now that's a common idea. Now that's something that we take as basically a truth, a sacred truth, a principle that we all sort of adhere to. Source to the Old Testament. That's not the only truly revolutionary idea in the Old Testament that can be sourced to it. There's a couple of others that I'll talk about in the months and years to come. That's just one. So, I don't know. Yeah, I'm rambling a little, but whatever. So, it was a cool conversation. Yeah, I'm rambling a lot. All right, well, whatever, Sometimes I'm firing on all 5 cylinders. Sometimes it's Saturday morning, I'm a little sleepy. The conversation between Stephanie and Dr. Josh was cool and civilized, exactly as I would expect it to be. So, that's exactly how I would expected him to act. That's why I stood by his character. Why? Because that's how he is. If you're cool with Dr. Josh, he's going to be eminently reasonable with you. The real issue at hand here with the Old Testament is that there's been a propaganda war, a sustained propaganda campaign against the one source of true morality in the ancient world. In the ancient Near East. Now, that's the real question for a scholar like Dr. Josh. Is there anything in the Hammurabi Code that points towards actual morality? In today's world, we could recognize that as if you don't say deeply Christian and deeply humanist, a really good principle of life. Because there are some in the Old Testament. That's the real argument about the Old Testament. There are some in the Old Testament. There are, as far as I know, none in any other sources. Now, there may be some in other religious texts on the other side of the globe. Buddhism, Hinduism, yada, yada, yada. But in the ancient Near East, were there other sources of actual moral awakening? Or is the Hammurabi Code just kind of the Old Testament without the moral voice, without the Christ-like voice, without the voice of humanism, if you want? I don't know. That's a real question. And, maybe I'll research that myself. But that's the question that I would ask the scholar. Is there any other source of true morality that you can find in the ancient Near East? Other than the Old Testament. Because that I would be truly curious about. So anyways, yeah, rambling a lot. Well, whatever, Saturday morning, Yeah, I guess that's all for now. That is all for now. Okay, this is the message ended. Go in peace. Amen.